I'm Jana Martin, Chief Executive Officer of the American Insurance Trust, known to most of you simply as the Trust. We're delighted that you're able to join us virtually today for the next webinar in our virtual webinar series. The Trust is pleased to be able to offer this informative content free of charge to our policyholders. Most of you are likely familiar with our risk management consultation service, the Advocate 800 program. It's one of the many benefits our policyholders receive through the Trust. 3 of our advocates are with us today, Drs. Joe Scropo, Julie Jacobs, and Liesl Bryant. This credit can be combined with 5 other CE credits from any of our live or on-demand virtual webinar series to save 15% on your Trust-sponsored professional liability insurance policy. I hope everyone learns a lot over the next hour. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed presenters.
Great. Thank you, Jana, and welcome everyone. We are delighted to be with you guys today. And as usual, we're going to start with some questions that we've either just been getting a lot of, or also I had a couple people write in this time with questions in particular. So we're going to start with some of those. And then of course, we'll be taking your live Q&A questions from the box. So definitely don't forget to write in your questions in the Q&A box. And Julie, I'll start with you. This is a question that we've gotten a lot. We've actually talked some about in prior roundtables, but this is a slightly different bent. So the question that came in was, I am planning to transition exclusively to a home office, providing only teletherapy services, and no longer maintain an office outside my home. Do I still need business liability insurance in this case?
It's a great question. And like so many risk management questions, the answer is it depends. One of the things, I think a basic element of this is to really understand what these different types of insurance mean. And so, if you're working out of a home office and you own your home, you will have a homeowner's insurance policy, hopefully. Most homeowners insurance policies will exclude losses related to business offices or home offices. And so, for example, if you were to experience a fire in your home and your home office was damaged, they may deny any losses associated with that home office. However, most homeowners insurance policies will offer some sort of an endorsement that can allow you to cover that home office. And it may be less expensive than a standalone policy. So a first option might be to have a conversation with your homeowner's policy agent. Let them know that you have this home office and see what kind of options you have available to you. See what would be covered and if it feels like that would be adequate coverage for your needs. And again, that might be less expensive than trying to purchase a separate office policy. There are a couple of different kinds of policies we're talking about when we talk about business policies. One of them is, the Trust has a business office policy that you can absolutely get if you have a home office. And that's pretty comprehensive coverage. It includes coverage for things like business personal property, lost income and expenses. It has some general liability coverage for third-party bodily injury or for property damage. So you can get a home office policy. It won't replace your homeowner's policy, right? So you would certainly want to make sure that you keep that in place. But you could, if you want something really pretty comprehensive, that's a nice option. There's also something we call an office overhead policy, which is a little different. And this is something where if you experience some sort of disability and you're not able to work, it covers those overhead expenses. It can cover your regularly occurring business expenses, which can include mortgage interest payments, employee salaries, office utilities, and some even professional liability insurance premiums if you don't have income and you need that coverage. You can get your home office covered by a policy like this. But you have to have a clearly documented and defined office setup. It has to be active office use that's dedicated only to that use. Generally, you can provide documentation of tax filings because you also have sort of tax considerations with the home office. And if you've been filing taxes and including that home office as a deduction of some kind, that can be a documentation of that active office use that would apply for that overhead policy. It's a lot of insurance jargon. It is not easy to understand, and I definitely recommend that you check with your insurance agents. So whether that, in addition to your homeowner's insurance policy, if you're a trust insured, you can certainly call and talk to some of our coverage folks. Or if you have other insurance, then you can check and see what options they have, and just make sure that it would apply to a home office and that you've got all the coverage you need. There's a lot of different things to consider. Also, some of your general professional liability insurance would kick in if there were to be some sort of, injury at the office, but we're talking about a telehealth only office. So it's less likely. You're not likely to have clients and patients coming in there. So that might not be what you're needing and what you're thinking about. So I'm back to it depends, and it's the kind of thing that you really need to do some research about and make sure you understand what those different types of policies would cover and what's going to be most appropriate for your needs.
Great. That was great, Julie. You fit in a lot there. Joe, do you want to add anything? Oops, Joe, I think you're muted, actually.
Sorry about that. Just that if you're, even though you may not be seeing clients in your home, when you have a teletherapy office, it's possible that people will come for some business purpose to see you. And there's always the possibility that someone will slip or fall or be injured in some way. So even though you have a telehealth home office just for telehealth, it still may be wise to carry premises liability. It's usually not that expensive. And, if the Poland Spring guy just collapses on your living room, you have some peace of mind. So, so that's basically it. And as I said, it's not too expensive, and it's definitely worth it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Joe. So we're going to move on to the second question, which is about what do we do sort of when patients request letters from us for third parties? And this is a question, Joe, we get a lot, but we're getting in some ways more of now also in with COVID and people wanting letters to not have to go back to work and things like that. So the specific question is, what are some of the ethical and risk management considerations that clinicians should take into account when asked to write a letter for a third party, asked by a client to write a letter for a third party? And Joe, I'll let you begin.
Okay. It's a good question. It's surprising to me how many different reasons people ask therapists for letters. As I've gotten many calls over the years, sometimes I'm amazed about some of the third-party requests that come through. But you should expect that at some point, if you haven't already, your client is going to ask you for a letter. It's perhaps a commentary that mental health treatment information is more and more being used in other contexts. So some of the possibilities for getting a letter would be if your client wants to use their Family and Medical Leave Act, which gives them some time off from work for a health emergency for themselves or their family. Other reasons that you may be requested to write a letter would be things like someone's going through a divorce or a custody proceeding, and they want you to attest to their good character. Less frequent kinds of requests have to do with people applying for security clearances with the government. And part of that process involves someone coming to your office and seeking to have you check off some boxes on a form as to whether your client is capable of maintaining a security clearance safely or not. So that there's a myriad range of possibilities as to how this may arise. And although you may think that, this is not going to happen to me, it almost certainly will. And it raises certain issues. The first set of issues are ethical issues. To sort of go through some of those ethical issues, the first one is beneficence, the idea that we try to help. We're there to help our patients, and it feels like there's a pull to be helpful when a patient asks you for a letter. They need something, and often it's something important, and many of us would feel a pull to try to make our clients' lives easier. But unfortunately, pure beneficence, if that's the only factor you look at, is probably the principle that gets psychologists into the most trouble. Because we're here to do good, but we can only do it in our professional status, in the way that we're trained and have service to provide. And there are many things that our clients might need that we can't provide and wouldn't be proper to give them. So that raises some additional issues. The next one being competence. Am I competent to write this letter? Is the issue that the person is asking me to address something that I can have confidence that I am able to give a professional opinion grounded in science and professional work? That may be the case, maybe not. The next role, or the next ethical principle, is dual role. When someone asks you to write a letter, they're asking you to step out to some degree, potentially, from your therapist role, so that you're now making an evaluative judgment about some issue. Do they qualify for disability? Are they able to work? And so on. So there's a kind of dual role phenomenon that occurs, and that can create problems as well if not carefully managed. So that's something to keep in mind in the situation. Maybe the most important ethical principle is the principle that says we don't make misleading, deceptive, or fraudulent statements. So when we write a letter, we're not free to write whatever we want, whatever the patient would want. We need to ask ourselves, would this letter be misleading or deceptive in some way, either through what it contains or what I've omitted from the letter? The last issue would be bias, that because we have an ongoing relationship potentially with this person, we may have developed feelings one way or the other about them. And that's fine contained in the therapy, but when the material is going to flow out, there's a potential that our positive bias toward our patient or even our negative bias might influence whether we choose to write it and the contents of what we do write. So the risk management issues that are of concern here, I'd say the first one would be the potential impact on the therapy, that even the mere act of entertaining the patient's request means you're going to say yes or no. And the potential impact of a no answer is significant. So you need to consider how that, how entertaining that request, how that could affect the therapy itself. The content of what you write may also have an impact on the therapy. The person may think that what you've written is not good or isn't true, or is not what they want, and then that may reverberate back into the treatment. They may be very happy with what you write and then see you as a source of future letters without really understanding that that's not your role here. An additional risk management concern is that it's not always clear what's going to happen with the letter. You give it to the patient and they may use it, or you send it to a third party. And sometimes there are unintended consequences that the patient was not aware of, but may hold you responsible for. So disclosing a lot of sensitive information that somehow backfires on what the patient is hoping to achieve. And the possibility that they may feel that ultimately you're writing a letter harmed them in some way. Wouldn't be fair to hold you responsible, but patients aren't operating necessarily on a logical basis here. The final risk management concern would have to do with the possibility that the consumer of the letter, the employer, the disability insurance company, whoever it is that's ultimately getting the letter, may really take issue with what you write and may push back at you and say, how do you know this? So they may ask for records, and it may begin to sort of further enmesh the treatment into the situation that's external to the treatment. So those are the ethical and risk management basic concerns. I'll be back after Julie to talk about some of the practical things you can do when you are asked for a letter.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Joe. That was very comprehensive. I know a couple people have written in too about other, like they mentioned, special test accommodations, disability, and also writing letters for emotional support animals, right? These are all situations that are, exactly what Joe is talking about there. And I think everything you said is relevant for each of those. Julie, do you want to add anything?
I just want to not really add, but just highlight a couple of the things that I think were so important, because I do think this pull that we feel to help our clients and patients can get us into trouble, right? And Joe said something about, if you're going to write an opinion, make sure it's an opinion you can support with science and with the facts and the data that you have in front of you. Because I know I get callers all the time who say, yeah, I really think this person would benefit from X, Y, or Z, but they don't have any basis for that other than the patient's report and just a general feeling. And so I have to say, of course you have opinions, but make sure that if you offer an opinion in writing in a formal way, that it's something that you can really justify and support. And it's not just a personal feeling you have because of your alliance with this person. I think everything Joe said was right on point. We get these questions a lot, and it is, I think, because we're helping professionals and we feel like, sure, I have an opinion on that and I can help. And you really have to think about those pitfalls.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think the question of, and Joe raised this, like, are we competent to even answer this? Just because we think we have an opinion and we think we know thoroughly this person, we may not be competent to answer, because we may not have, outside collateral information or those kinds of things to answer some of these questions. And I know, Joe, I won't steal your thunder, so to speak, because I know you're going to get at more about what are the actual steps for risk management. So if we're going to entertain these, what are we going to do? And we're going to come right back to you on that. So before we do that, though, let me fit in one more question back to what Julie initially was talking about a little bit with the home office. And we really have continued to get calls on this. And like, as I said before, we've talked a little bit in prior roundtables on this, but can you just sort of give us a brief overview of some of the additional factors that clinicians should really take into consideration when they're making that decision? Should I go to a home only office and completely get rid of my sort of brick and mortar office, so to speak?
I will try to keep it brief, but it's a tough one. But it is, we keep getting these calls, and I think many of us were hoping that at this, by this point, we would be in a different position and we could think about maybe going back to more traditional therapy. And it looks like we're going to be stuck in this situation for a while. So I think that's why the question keeps coming up. And before I even go into this, we do have an FAQ on this because it is one that came up a couple other roundtables ago. So please be sure to take a look at that. And because we have that, I will try to practice brevity, which is not a strong point of mine, but I'll try to zip through these considerations. One of the ones, I think the main one is clinical considerations, right? Do you have the clinical population that would benefit from this? Do the kinds of interventions that you do work on a teletherapy only basis? If you're doing evaluations and assessments, there's a lot of limitations. So teletherapy only may not be the best option for you. And what is your comfort level with this being all you do, right? You're going to be a remote provider from now on, or at least for the foreseeable future. Is that something you're comfortable with? And do you feel like your client population is going to continue to benefit from the services that you provide? You'll have a lot less flexibility than you might have otherwise. So if you have patients who have a higher level of need or who aren't appropriate for teletherapy, you may end up having to refer folks out that you would like to see, but you just don't have the capacity to see them in person. Also, if you also have to think about the fact that there may be situations that are crisis or emergent situations where you really do feel like you need to be able to meet with someone in person. And this may not be, maybe you don't want to meet them in your home office. So it might be a good idea to think about, is there a backup plan? Do you have a colleague whose office you can use? Or is there some way that you can find a setting where you can meet with someone on occasion if needed? I wouldn't set that expectation. If you're moving to telehealth only, you want to try to respect your own boundary there. But there are going to be situations that we can't necessarily predict where you might need to be able to meet with someone in person. Again, clinically, you want to screen folks really carefully. One idea I've seen is, instead of doing kind of our typical phone screening and our phone conversation to set something up, that you move to doing that via a telehealth platform. And that way you can get a better sense of whether this client or patient is someone who's able to use the tech, who feels comfortable with it, if you're able to connect with them in a meaningful way before you even decide if you're going to move forward with them as a client. And then the last thing from a clinical standpoint is we always have to follow the standards of care. So be aware of what the standards of care are for practice and for telehealth, and specifically make sure that you can confirm the patient's identity, that you have appropriate informed consent, that you have a crisis plan in place. So all of those things that we know we need to do with telehealth. The next set of considerations are provider considerations. Work-life harmony can be challenging when your work and home life are in the same place. And so think about how you can establish boundaries and make sure that you still have room to have a home life and not feel like you're working 24/7. Additionally, do you have room in your space or space in your house to do this? Do you have an appropriate private confidential area where you can do this? Do you have little children running around, or do you have the ability to really kind of confine yourself and do the work and focus and stay in the right mode and the right mindset to do the work at home? You also have a lot of potential for isolation. We get used to kind of curbside consultations, talking with office mates or people that we interact with regularly, and you won't have that kind of interaction. So might be a really good idea to set up some kind of peer consultation group where you meet regularly and can make sure that you still maintain those connections and consult with others as you need to. A couple of sort of legal and contractual kinds of issues. A real basic one is, do you have a lease? And if you have a lease, can you get out of it, or is it about to end? Just thinking about not wanting to breach your own contractual obligations that you may have. And then think about if your state or if your insurance companies have any kind of requirement to have face-to-face services. Some states, I know Colorado used to have a requirement that the initial session had to be face-to-face before you can engage in teletherapy. They have since done away with that, but that's something to be aware of. Or to make sure that your insurance company doesn't require that you have a physical office space that's available to see patients. There's also the insurance reimbursement question, right? Right now, we have a lot of good reimbursement for teletherapy, but is that going to continue, and is that going to be an issue for you if you decide to move to that as your primary modality? And then just real practical considerations. You got to notify your liability carrier, you got to notify the board, you've got to notify your insurance companies of the change in your office address. And what office address are you going to use? You may not want to be posting your home office or your home address on your paperwork. And so you might want to make sure if there's an option to use a PO box, or if the insurance company requires a physical address, can they protect that information and maintain your security and your privacy and not share that with patients who look you up online? Always good idea to talk with your CPA. I kind of alluded to that earlier about some of the tax considerations with the home office. So make sure that you understand what those are and what impact might be of having a home office. And if you're moving to tech only and telehealth only, also consider a cyber liability policy, because you're going to be more dependent on tech. You may have a higher liability or a higher probability of some kind of breach or a tech issue, and a cyber liability policy might be really helpful for you. So that is a somewhat brief overview of some of the considerations, and certainly you can get into more detail if you look at that FAQ, or Joe and Lisa, you might have some other ideas as well.
Yeah, no, that was great. Joe, any addition you want to add?
Yeah, just two quick things. One is that when I had a home office quite a long time ago, and I told the insurance company about it, they actually sent out someone to inspect the home office to make sure that it met the conditions of being separate, as having a separate entrance and other things. And I ended up having to put a big exit sign over the door to make them happy. But so be aware that insurance companies may want to look at your home office. They're probably not going to just take your answer, it's just telehealth. They may want to see it. So just be aware of that. And the second is the weakening of boundaries that can easily happen in a home office. Sound, people moving around, phone calls in other rooms, all this kind of stuff can make a real difference. And when I had young kids, they would wave at my patients as they came from the front window, which was okay, but you may not want to have that. So just a couple of things to keep in mind.
Yeah, those are great points, Joe, and that makes it, brings it right down to the reality. I wonder, now with COVID, they may not be inspecting offices now because of the health risk, but once COVID clears up, they may go back to that. So I'm really glad you brought up that point. All right, last question before we move to the live Q&As, which are coming in. So we'll get to that in a moment, but I just want to come back to you, Joe, then on with those third-party letters that you were talking about earlier. What would you say are sort of the primary ways that clinicians can reduce risk if they choose to write a letter, or if they're going to respond to the request from the patient for that?
Okay, yeah. That's really the crux of this issue. I should have said with competence, why we're not competent or may not be competent. It's because usually the issue that is called for to be commented on by us in the patient's request is often something we have no real knowledge about. So if the person wants disability, they need a letter, or they may need to prove that they can't work to their employer. But we, of course, don't follow our patients to work and watch them and see what they do. And we may not even really know what the demands are there. So that's where the competency issue comes into play. Similarly, with the national security clearance thing, I mean, do we really know whether a patient, are we competent to give an opinion about whether a patient is going to be able to maintain secrets? This is something that probably it did not come up in the therapy. So when I say competence, I don't mean that we're not competent professionals, that we're not competent to give an opinion that's grounded in some kind of scientific or professional basis to answer the question that the person is asking us to answer in the letter. So to get to what you can do, the very first and most important fact, I think, is to know that you can say no. This sometimes feels like a dirty word to therapists, but saying no when you know that you shouldn't be doing something is going to save you and ultimately the patient a lot of trouble. So know that you can say no. Say it politely, explain why, but it's always an option for you. The only thing that you must do is produce records in request to a patient's response, to turn over records to a third party to evaluate whatever the issue is that the third party needs to know from you. That's the only thing you need to do. Writing letters is optional and at your discretion. The next thing to consider is that one possibility is to say, I don't do that, but I can refer you to a forensic psychologist who can do it, who does that kind of work. And the advantage of that is that you keep the therapy separate from this evaluative process, and the person deals with someone else, not you, about the letter. And so you kind of have a nice, neat boundary there. And there's no, or hopefully no issue of bias or selectivity in what you report because a third party is doing it. If you do decide to write something, our suggestion would be to write just the facts of treatment and avoid expressing an ultimate opinion on whatever the issue is, such as, can this person work? Can they maintain a secret for security reasons? Are they a good parent or not a good parent? These are things that what we can do is give facts. We can give information about the treatment. We can talk about when they saw us, what they said, what diagnosis we gave, what we observed about their demeanor and behavior. And often the consumer of the letter can read between the lines and kind of use that information to make a decision without us having to stick our neck out beyond where it should go. Data, but not opinions, would be the principle here. Another issue is to make sure the client understands the role, the potential dual role that's involved. So that if you say to them, I can't write the letter that you want, and the reason is that I'm not in this evaluative role, and you explain it to the patient. The more the patient understands your reasoning, the less likely they are to be upset with you and complain against you. Again, if you do write a letter, I would suggest starting it out with a disclaimer that provides context for the consumer of the letter. So it might say, I am Mr. X's treating therapist. Mr. X has asked me to write this letter. I'm writing it with upon his authorization. I have not conducted a formal evaluation of Mr. X's capacity to work. That's beyond my role as a therapist, but here's some information I can give you. So the disclaimer helps the consumer of the letter have a context and know what limitations there are around the information that you're giving. And finally, I would recommend that you show the letter to the patient before you send it. You really want to avoid a situation where you send it out, the client finds out about it later and takes massive offense to something that was written that you thought was relatively innocent. So just to avoid that trouble, I would suggest showing the letter, not saying that you're going to change it unless there's something factually wrong, but at least the client can then make a decision one way or the other, and they're not going to be surprised later. So that would be, in a nutshell, the things to think about and how to respond to the request.
Yeah, no, great, Joe. And I'll just add one, and then Julie, I'll see if you have any additions. But the only other thing I can think to add to that is that someone, if you know you're not going to want to write these letters, in many instances, you can put a general statement about that in your informed consent document, right? Just saying that I don't write, third-party letters, or I don't do this because of the very reasons that Joe has mentioned. And that doesn't mean that clients won't still ask you for them, but it does mean that you've sort of addressed the issue up front, and it can help sometimes limit that surprise or anger when you do say no to a client. You can just go back and say, remember, this wasn't informed consent, and here's why it's really important, but let me help you find someone, that kind of thing, which I think can often be useful. Julie, any addition there?
I don't have a lot to add. I think that was a really comprehensive answer. I love the idea of the disclaimer and the introductory statement, of making it really clear who you are and what you are doing and what you have not done. So there's no illusion that, yes, I've conducted an evaluation of this person's ability to work. No, I'm basing this on the facts that I have at hand. And I really like that as a way to frame the whole letter for folks. But yeah, otherwise, I think that was great. We get that question a lot too, because we get those requests a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all right. Okay, so we are going to dive into the Q&As here. The first is addressing telehealth, and the question is, can you speak a little more about providing telehealth for clients who travel out of state briefly? Some states are cumbersome, very cumbersome to apply for temporary license. Some of them, maybe they're addressing Florida here, require a registered agent, which is confusing and sometimes expensive for just one session. And I know, we could spend an entire hour on how do we handle the telehealth interjurisdictional issues. So I am, because we have a bunch of questions, going to ask, I guess I'll start with you, Julie, and then Joe, if you want to add anything, but just sort of quick response to help give some guidance to that.
Yeah. And I think it's important that this question is about brief amount of time, right? About someone being gone for a short amount of time versus a longer amount of time, because I think the answer is quite different. When you think about interjurisdictional practice, I mean, obviously you have to think about the legal aspect of it and the licensure aspect of it. And you also have to consider your clinical and your ethical obligations here, right? And so if you have an ongoing client who you've been working with, who is benefiting from weekly sessions and who could potentially end up being harmed in some way if those sessions stop while they're out of town for 2 weeks, your clinical and ethical justifications for engaging in that work are really quite solid. And it's quite possible that the state that they're traveling to does have some sort of exemption to licensure or temporary practice provision that would allow you to practice into that state. Now, that definitely varies state by state. Some of them are very simple, and there's no requirement beyond you need to be licensed in another state, and you can only do it for X number of days per year. Other states, like you alluded to, you have to register, you have to apply for a temporary license. Those things are just too cumbersome if you're talking about 1 or 2 sessions. And so the way we try to think about it is, if it's really temporary, if it's a couple of sessions, if it's clinically and ethically indicated and justified, then the risk of doing that is relatively low. You want to document your justifications very carefully. Okay, ideally it's a state that you can practice into anyway, and you don't have to worry about that interjurisdictional, the licensure piece. But I think we have to think about it as a balance. And if clinically and ethically it is important for us to maintain continuity of care, to avoid abandonment, to avoid harm to our clients, document those reasons. And if you're not licensed in that state and you've provided 1 session while that person was out of town temporarily, your risk is going to be quite low that you're going to have a negative outcome there, or a complaint filed that comes to anything, if you have documented those justifications really carefully. And that's as brief as I can be on that one.
Yeah, that was perfect. You did a great job. You covered a lot very quickly. Joe?
Yeah, there's 2 kind of waivers on the prohibition against interjurisdictional practice. Meaning that you're not licensed in the jurisdiction, so normally you'd be prohibited from delivering services into that jurisdiction. The 2 kind of waivers are the traditional long-standing waivers that almost every state has to allow temporary practice. The requirements vary drastically across states as to how onerous or not it is to obtain those traditional temporary practice privileges. In all cases, they're limited, time limited. The second kind of waiver is unique to our current situation, which is the pandemic. And a large number of states have instituted COVID waivers, allowing interstate provision of services by persons not licensed in that jurisdiction. with various requirements, but it's certainly more liberal than the traditional waivers, but still it's brief. It's going to expire upon expiration of the public health emergency. So in all cases, if you do operate under either of these waivers, be planned from the beginning as to what you're going to do when the waiver expires. That would be my main point here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Joe, because I wanted to underscore that also, that either, whether it's the temporary practice law or the COVID waiver, those are really only meant for temporary practice. I know we've gotten a lot of calls about people who, have clients that are permanently moving to another state, not just temporarily because of the pandemic, but really moving permanently, or getting a call from someone in another state who is never going to move to your state, is always going to be in the state in which you're unlicensed and wants treatment during the pandemic. So those are much more, there's no real allowance to practice long-term in another state where you're not licensed. You want to get licensed in that state. But these are complex issues. I want to just remind folks, of course, too, that for trust insurers, you can call in and consult with us about this. So if you have specific questions, specific states, we can help you locate some of the statutes. I know sometimes some of these things are hard to find, so don't hesitate to call in and consult on these questions. Okay, next question. What is the criteria for duty to warn when a patient says they are scared by thoughts of hurting an older family member? No specific plan, but had the thought, realistically says they won't do it, and the grandparent has a partner. Joe, do you want to start on that one for us?
Sure. Okay, so duty to protect or duty to warn, which is also referred to as Tarasoff type laws, vary quite a bit from state to state. There are actually some states that do not have a Tarasoff provision or a duty to protect or warn. If you happen to be in one of those states, if you were to disclose, you'd be breaching confidentiality without any legal protection to do so, and thus you'd be exposed to risk to suit or complaint for breaching confidentiality. So the first point is to remember that your ability to breach, meaning to disclose information to try to protect a third party, can only occur when there's a legal exception or permission to breach confidentiality. So you need to check your state law to see what the specifics are. For the most part, Tarasoff laws have a kind of similarity to them. The essence is that the patient poses a serious and imminent risk of physical harm, serious physical harm, to an identifiable victim or victims. That's generally the way that it's thought of. So in this particular case, what you would do would be to identify the Tarasoff standard in your jurisdiction. You take the facts as you have them, as the patient has reported them to you, and you would determine, do the facts fulfill the criteria in the Tarasoff law in my jurisdiction? And then you would have a conclusion. Yes, they do. And I've taken the following steps. And many of the Tarasoff laws in various states tell you what your options are to breach, how you can discharge the duty. Or you may say, no, I'm not, the facts don't meet the criteria and I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to breach because I don't believe there's sufficient justification to do so. The key point here is A, gather information, know your own state law about Tarasoff duties. And the hard part is to compare them and determine whether the facts meet it or not. In the scenario that you described, the patient is fearful of acting on these impulses, which would suggest to me that it may not be serious, it may not be imminent. But again, these are things that you want to explore further and discuss and clarify.
Great, thank you, Joe. Julie, anything to add?
Just that this is a perfect situation to use a couple of our basic risk management strategies, which are consult. You can call us and we can help you figure out what the standard is in your state and conduct that analysis, and then document. So Joe described the analysis really well. Apply the facts of the situation to the standard that you have in your state and document it, and document what you do and why, and document what you don't do and why. And those are ways to, these are just the basic risk management tools that apply really well to this kind of situation.
Mhm. Great. Thank you. Okay, next question. And this is, I think we're going to start seeing more and more of these questions related to COVID, and things are worsening with the numbers of COVID increasing. So the question here is, just recently, some counties in California bumped up from red to purple tier, meaning that many businesses will now go back to outdoor services. So the question is, can I continue to see patients in an indoor clinic situation with all precautions, including 6 feet distance, consent, masks, etc., or should I go back to telehealth only? Julie, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I mean, these again are very state specific, because what you'll find is a lot of times, even when you do go down to, in my state, it's red, but purple in California, that the businesses that are considered essential businesses, or whatever the terminology is in your state, often are still allowed to operate in some limited capacity. And so, and gosh, I think all of us risk management consultants have gotten more expert than we would want to be at reading and interpreting executive orders and public health orders to try to figure out, is a mental health practice considered an essential business? And if so, what are the protocols that are required in order to see people face to face? I mean, my suggestion is, if it's feasible to do telehealth and you're able to serve people well, that's a good option. But if that's not working and you want to continue to see people in person, you're going to need to do some research about what exactly is your state's guidance. And sometimes it's not at the state level, it's at the county level. And so you look at the state level, you also look at your county public health department and see what kind of public health orders are out there. And then make sure that at a minimum, you are following whatever those requirements are. And I'll give an example. Here in Colorado, there is some guidance out there that you are able to see clients in person in your office. And you must wear masks the whole time, even if you are able to maintain the 6 foot distance. And so we have a lot of folks who say, well, my office is huge. I'm seeing clients in a conference room. We're 12 feet away. The state guidance says you must still wear a mask. And so you need to make sure that you're following those state protocols. And many of them are tied to the CDC protocols and recommendations. And so it can be a little bit of a rabbit hole to go down to try to unwind exactly what's required in your area. But it's important to follow those standards, because otherwise, if you're not doing what's required, you could be considered to be operating in a negligent manner, and that could really lead to some liability. Again, it's another thing that we can try to help you with if you're a trust insured. I've read a whole bunch of public health orders in the past 6 months. And so I think we're all getting a little more expert at that. But a frustration with it is some of them are 30 days at a time. And so you don't really know what's going to happen in the next little chunk of time. So there's a lot of refreshing and having to update your own knowledge base and know what's expected in your area.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. And I will add too, and Joe, I want to get your thoughts too, but I think some of this also has to be an individual decision. Not just, of course, individual for the clinician, but you might need to make different decisions for different patients, that it really is an analysis that you're doing for each individual client that you're seeing, because I'm not sure that we can do a one size fits all right now. And so I think, even though it's frustrating and it does sometimes mean more work or feels more complex to us, I think the situation right now really requires us to be doing that and talking with individual clients about, is this right for them in this situation? And it may also change. It may be right this week and next week it may not be. Yep. So there's a lot of complexity here, and I underscore the idea to consult. Joe, any additional thoughts you want to add?
Just to point out, I think you covered it very well. Just to point out that we have resources on our website at trustinsurance.com under COVID resources that provide some informed consents for return to face-to-face contacts. Those can be very useful if you're going to do it. And the information there will, I think, help you reason out whether this is a good choice or not a good choice.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you for bringing those up. That's great. Yeah, they're on the COVID page on our website. So feel free to look at those. Okay, another comment here. Majority of my clients have expressed concern regarding the divisive politics in our country. I'm managing the sessions, but I'm open to other guidance. This is a little hard maybe from a risk management perspective. There's no clear question, but Joe and Julie, do you have any sort of comments on sort of how, I mean, because we're all facing this, right? And it has been very intense. So sort of from a risk management or ethical perspective, any guidance you can offer, short of our standard, which is consult and talk and those kinds of things. But Joe, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't really see the value of discussing politics in psychotherapy, in the sense that if the intent is to have a true exchange of views between you and your patient, I'm not sure that's really this is the right place to be doing that. I think where it does manifest is in the patient's statements and their emotional state and what they report about, how they're reacting to events. And the question then becomes, do I engage in some self-disclosure to reassure or form an alliance with this patient? And there, I think that's up to your own personal style, the way you do therapy and the way you are as a person. I think the congruence between who you are and how you work is important. So if it feels unnatural to do it, I don't think you should do it. But if it's part of your repertoire, then perhaps sharing some of your own experience, struggle with more with the uncertainty, without putting blame or identifying any targets, because I think that will take away from the therapy. But merely talking about your emotional reactions, I think that's a decision that you want to think about and how you want to handle that. I don't recommend, frank, overt political discussions, because I think the risk is way too high that you're going to derail the therapy and the patient is going to complain against you.
Yeah, I agree. Julie, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a really delicate balance. And I think, you want to think about what is the meaning of this for the client? Why are they bringing it up, and how do you explore? And I think Joe hit it right on the head. A lot of it is just the uncertainty and the tension that people are feeling, and that's on all sides. And so that's a commonality that we can, you can certainly understand and work through and talk to the client about, without necessarily having to get into self-disclosure and talking about what your personal views are. You can certainly join with them on the general feeling of, wow, a lot of people really are feeling uncertain, and what does that feel like to you, and what does that mean for you, and how is that manifesting in your life? But I agree, that there may be some temptation to jump on the same bandwagon with your client and say, yes, I agree, and I'm so angry about that, and that's not appropriate. That's a real blurring of your boundary, of your role. Self-disclosure should be used appropriately and with a clinical purpose and in the interest of the client, not because you want to feel like you've got someone else on your team sitting in your office. So just being really careful. It's 2020, boy. I mean, between COVID and the political atmosphere, we are all going through a lot together. And so for us to be able to process our own reactions to what's going on outside of the therapy room, outside of the therapy room where we're the therapist, right? We can certainly explore those in the therapy room with our own therapist. And just making sure that we have our own outlets and ways to kind of manage that tension so it doesn't bleed too much into the work that we're doing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I too was going to underscore those same things. Just the idea that, whatever happens in therapy, of course, should be about the client and what does the client need and what is the focus and why is the client raising it and how can you help address them in a clinical manner. I do think I'll just mention sort of, and I know we've talked about this too before, but the whole idea of self-care for the therapist, right? Because it's intense. There's a lot of intensity, and sometimes it can be hard sitting with folks listening to maybe opposing political views that we can't engage on or shouldn't engage on, as Joe, you mentioned. And or like you're saying, Julie, maybe we want to sort of buddy and like have someone in it with us. So I think there's a whole bunch of our own personal reactions that we do want to make sure we're processing, but outside of the therapy room, right? With our own family or friends or a therapist or whatever that may be. And then of course, just taking care of ourselves. I mean, good self-care is good risk management and is clinical practice. Okay, I am noticing the time and I do want to fit in as many of these additional questions as possible. So we'll see if we can move through some here very, very quickly. This question may be too specific to states, but I'll ask it anyhow. It says, if you see someone in another state, do you need to have a PC in Florida since you need a registered agent? Joe, do you want to jump in there, or we may not know the state specific, we might need to.
The concept of registering typically applies to corporations or business formal business entities. If you're a sole proprietor, you're not going to need to register as a foreign corporation in another state. So if you do have a corporation, and this is going to be an ongoing process for you, it would be worth contacting the Secretary of State in the state that you're working at, you're telephoning or videoing into, and ascertain at what point a foreign corporation must register. The purpose is that in case you're served with a suit, there's someone in that state to accept service for that suit. That's generally the reason why foreign corporations have to register. So if it's a very small operation and you're not a corporate entity in your business, I think it's very unlikely. But the definite answer would be to call or email Secretary of State in the state that you're going to be working in.
Yeah, and I do just want to jump in there, Joe, because with Florida specifically, I know under their new telehealth law, they do require that a psychologist get a registered agent. Now that's, I think, aside from whether you're, what your business is incorporated or not. I think if you're going to do telehealth under the new Florida telehealth law, but it's very specific to Florida. I'm not aware of other states who are doing that. They do require that registered agent. But I think the key point is it's very state specific. And like Joe said, if you have questions, you'll need to, certainly you can call us and consult and we can see if we can find the answers for you, or you'll need to contact that state directly to get clarity on that as well.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. I think you're right, Liesl. I do think that Florida has that requirement for registered agents in order to register to do telehealth into Florida. And I do know that there are registered agent companies, right, that you can just sign up for and someone can act as a registered agent on your behalf. So I don't know, I haven't looked into that specifically, but there's a possibility that that would be an option that you could apply to have a registered agent in Florida through one of those services without having to create a PC or a PLLC or anything like that.
Yeah, Julie, there's actually a list in Florida. You can
great.
find it on their website. Yeah, so I was looking this up for someone the other day. That's why I know off the top of my head.
Okay.
Oh, perfect. Okay, next question. I have been informed that if I am licensed in 2 states, I can provide telepsychology from my office in one of those states to a client in the other state without needing any permissions or authorizations. Is this correct? I think this is pretty straightforward. Julie, why don't you grab that one?
Yes. So if you are licensed where the patient is located, and this SIPACT flips this a little bit. So we're going to talk about non-SIPACT situations where the services are considered to be happening where the patient is located. If you have a license where that patient is located, they're physically sitting in Colorado and you are licensed in Colorado, but you're sitting in Utah, you're still practicing legally under your Colorado license. The idea is the board wants to have jurisdiction over you if you hurt their consumers. And so because you would have a Colorado license, the board could still issue sanctions against you if you did something wrong to their Colorado consumer. So yes, if you're licensed where they're located, it generally doesn't matter where you are located as long as you're licensed where the patient is sitting.
Right, great. Joe, anything before I toss another question at you guys?
Yeah, that's my general understanding as well. Most state regs and laws are not meant, they weren't written with the idea that someone was going to be providing service in another state. So it's often, there's no clear answer in the legislation or the law. But as a practical matter, I think it's very unlikely that the state where you're at is going to have any concerns about you reaching out to a separate another state where they don't have any duty to protect anybody. So as a practical matter, it's reasonably safe. But the actual legal answer, it remains unclear.
Right. And so sort of related to some of the telehealth, there's a question, what is the best ethical and legal practice regarding licensure with newly expanding telehealth services in this time of the pandemic? Refers to being licensed in multiple states. There's no national license as of now, to clarify that question. But I think, again, there's far more than we can say, but if you could just speak to maybe some of the basic, right now there's a lot of confusion, SIPACT, non-SIPACT, not confusion, but complexity maybe is a better term. What are some, can you give just like 2 or 3 or 4 very basic ethical or risk management strategies that we as clinicians should think about as we're expanding into telehealth services? Julie, do you want to start on that?
Well, I think, you know, if you plan to do telehealth into other states, and that's going to be an important part of your practice, and you are in a state that is a PsyPact state, and PsyPact is the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact for those who don't know it, that would be certainly a way to consider going and get the e-passport, get the credential that allows you to practice into those other PsyPact states, and that's your credential, and you'll be practicing legally. But this is a very state-by-state specific thing. So, you know, again, if you know you're going to practice into 3 or 4 states, then it's worth looking into whether you can get licensure in those states if you're not in a PsyPact state. I think there are different ways to do it. You just need to be aware of what are the rules and laws where you're located, what are the rules and laws where the patients are located, and you need to try to abide by those as best you can, depending on what the circumstances are that you're practicing under.
Mm-hmm. Joe, any addition?
Yeah, I'll just add real quickly that, like a lot of questions in risk management, it has to do with what your own risk threshold is. This is something that varies from clinician to clinician. Some people never want to be on the wrong side of the law, even though it may never really be enforced. And they're not going to do service into a teletherapy into a state where there's not some regulatory waiver for them. Other folks are more willing to do it. And the reality is that as a practical matter, there's very little enforcement of it at this point in time. So my idea would be to gauge your own risk level, what you feel comfortable with after you know what the risks are, and that should dictate what you decide. But of course, always try to minimize the risk as much as possible under all circumstances.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's also important, especially because right now there is a lot of uncertainty, as we've mentioned, right? How long are the COVID waivers going to continue? Will insurance pay? You know, so I think it's really important, definitely, as Joe said, to think about our own risk level. What are we willing to tolerate or not? But we also then need to be communicating to the client, what are the uncertain pieces? Because if you're, you know, it may be that in 2 months you can't continue to see that client, or, you know, those kinds of things. And so I think it's really important that we be sure that we're sort of having open communication with the clients about that too, so that they know what to expect and what may or may not change down the line. And that's hard, I think, sometimes with some of the uncertainty.